Okay, so our second article today offers a theory-driven approach, a theory-driven ideas really, regarding how we can improve the degree to which consumers act as stewards of shared public goods, things like parks and drinking water and air quality. This paper that's coming out in the Journal of Marketing identifies a very simple psychological mechanism that can be used to increase these types of stewardship behaviors for the benefit of these public goods. And the resulting insights offer, as you'll see, very clear guidelines for marketers of all types and policymakers, people working in nonprofits, for developing easy to implement sustainability strategies. So we're joined today by Joann Peck from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Andrea Luangrath from the University of Iowa, who are part of a team of scholars working on this important topic. So welcome, Joann and Andrea. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Chris. This is Joann, and I'm going to start us off, and then Andrea is going to take over. We want to thank you, Chris, and the Journal of Marketing for allowing us to share our research today. We also want to acknowledge our amazing co-authors, Colleen Kirk at New York University Institute of Technology and Suzanne Shu at Cornell. So the title, Caring for the Commons, Strategies to Enhance Stewardship of Our Public Lands. So the four of us were trying to decide on an interesting project, and we all felt that the care and maintenance of public resources such as lakes and parks is really important. And this is reflected in this quote by Scott, "Everybody's property is nobody's property." This tendency to neglect common resources is known in economics as the tragedy of the commons. And a key insight is that shared ownership leads to diffusion of responsibility, so no one steps forward to take care of the resource. And people have been suggesting solutions for the tragedy of the commons for years. The most extreme solution is to convert public property to private property so that responsibility for stewardship is clear. But that's not practical for all public land. Other solutions include social influences where other people provide pressure to behave in an appropriate way. But what we really wanted to do is focus on the individual and ask whether we could have people feel as if a shared resource is privately owned and enhance stewardship without actually changing legal ownership. In other words, how can individuals be encouraged to take better care of public goods? And we are also very mindful that we wanted to have specific interventions and recommendations. So we also considered what simple interventions can managers use to increase stewardship. So what is psychological ownership and how do we increase it? So simply, psychological ownership is the feeling that something is mine. It is very distinct from legal ownership. So if you think about, remember when we used to go to offices, some of us still are, so this idea it's my office or it's my parking spot. You may not legally own it, but you feel a sense of ownership. So John Pierce brought this theory into management. And what's really interesting is in the 80s, companies were starting to offer employee stock options. And the idea was, well, when employees are actual legal owners, there's going to be all these positive work outcomes. Well, what they found is that's not true. You have to have this feeling or psychological ownership for these work outcomes to manifest. So there's also been work on how do we increase this feelings of ownership? Well, one way you can do it is investing the self into the target. And you'll see in the studies that we show you today, this is the way that we increase ownership. So for example, if you customize a product, then you're going to feel more ownership. If you build that bookcase, you invest some of your labor into that target, you're going to feel more ownership. Another way that you may feel ownership is controlling the target. So for a public land, it may be that you help control the opening hours or some of the rules surrounding the park. Anytime you have control, you're going to feel more ownership. And then finally, coming to intimately know a target. So with COVID, a lot of us is becoming very familiar with our neighborhood park. It may feel like, hey, that's my park. Because if you intimately know all the trails, you feel more ownership. So why do we care? If you feel more ownership, you feel more responsible for this target. And you also tend to perform stewardship behaviors in order to care for this target. So in this project, when we talk about stewardship, we talk about effort stewardship, such as picking up trash from a lake, but also financial stewardship. So will you donate money to help this public resource? And we also consider social media as far as a way to promote this public resource. So let me tell you about this first study. This is a public lake study. It happened here in Madison, Wisconsin, Lake Mendota. And the whole idea here is let's increase people's feelings of ownership and then see if we can increase stewardship. So as you recall, one way to increase ownership is investing the self. And the way we did this is we said to half of the kayakers, we want you to think of a nickname for the lake. So write it down. When you're out kayaking, maybe say it to yourself a few times, even say it out loud. So half of the group was told to think of the nickname and the other half, the control group, didn't. And we had some pretty creative and some less creative entries. So Lakey Lake, Big Blue, Beer. So those were some of the nicknames for the lakes. And then what we thought of, we needed a dependent variable on stewardship. And unbeknownst to our kayakers, we had a research assistant take a paddleboard out and plant trash in the lake. So we planted 4 pieces of trash, and we planted them so every kayak either going out or coming back in was no more than 6 feet from any piece of trash. And then we had 2 researchers on shore, one with binoculars, recording whether people attempted to pick up the trash. So again, remember, investing the self, thinking of a nickname of the lake, increases this feeling of ownership. Feels like it's my lake. And that increase in ownership should result in stewardship behaviors, picking up the trash. And that's what we found. So people in the nickname condition, 41% of those attempted to pick up the trash, whereas only 7% in the no nickname condition did so. We also measured feelings of ownership with a questionnaire, and we found that nicknaming increased this feeling, feels like it's my lake, and also demonstrated that it increases stewardship behavior.
We also conducted a second field experiment with cross-country skiers at a state park. Now, in this study, we wanted to test a new psychological ownership intervention. Maps were given to all of the skiers, but we asked half of the individuals to plan their ski route on the map, while this was not requested of the other half of the individuals. Our intuition was that having park visitors plan a route is a greater investment of the self, again, through their time and their energy, which will likely lead to greater feelings of ownership. In partnership with the park, we worked alongside the equipment rentals to solicit donations. The equipment rental staff programmed their PayPal application to enable patrons to add an additional $1 to their rental fee. So this is really our key outcome of interest, this willingness to give an additional $1 donation to the park. Note that in the prior lake study that Joann described, we were looking at effortful stewardship behaviors or picking up trash. But here we're interested in financial stewardship behaviors. We also surveyed the skiers after they returned their rental equipment. We asked the skiers the likelihood that they would volunteer to help the park, to like the park's Facebook page, and to post on Instagram using the park's hashtag. Our results revealed that planning a park did, in fact, increase skiers' psychological ownership. So of those who planned a route, 86% of skiers left an additional $1 donation, while only 32.7% left a donation when they did not plan a route. Similarly, route planners were significantly more likely to state that they would volunteer to help the park, as well as engage in positive word of mouth on behalf of the park. So, for example, liking the park on Facebook and promoting the park on Instagram. So again, the skiers who felt this sense of psychological ownership from planning their route were 2.5 times more likely to add that $1 additional to their rental fee. In this study, we also demonstrated that these stewardship behaviors are driven by a sense of responsibility. That when you feel psychological ownership of the park, this heightens the responsibility and the duty that you feel, which is what causes you to care for the park. We conducted a final study to investigate whether public goods managers might actually be inadvertently decreasing stewardship behaviors. So we conducted a scenario-based study in which we asked participants to imagine visiting Stoneview Park, a park 1 hour away from where they lived. Participants were told that the park has a nonprofit conservancy that maintains the park and is just asking a variety of people to provide their opinions regarding the park. So then participants were shown either a welcome to your park sign or a welcome to the park sign. We had tested this intervention in a prior study as well and found that the your park sign increases people's feelings of ownership. The scenario then continued on, and some of the participants were told that the park had installed an attendance sign. The attendance sign read, "This week, you are visitor number 22,452. In order to identify an appropriate number of visitors for this sign, we reviewed attendance data at US national and state parks to arrive at a reasonable number of weekly visitors. This type of visitor counter or attendance sign is very prevalent across a variety of public goods contexts. And we really wondered here whether the sign would actually decrease users' sense of responsibility. So was it the case that this would diffuse responsibility among these many visitors? Our primary outcome of interest in the study, again, was monetary donations. At the beginning of this study, we gave each participant 7 quarters, which was theirs to keep as a token of appreciation for participating in our study. However, during the study, we told them that if they wish to make a donation to the park, that they could place any or none of the quarters in an envelope that we provided to them. Participants were also told that how much they chose to donate or whether or not they donated anything at all was completely up to them and that no one would know if they made a donation. Our results revealed that seeing an attendance sign does inadvertently decrease donation behavior. So what we can see here is that the welcome to your park sign increases donation behavior, but for those who also saw the attendance sign, the donation behavior was significantly lessened. In this study, we see that an attendance sign does diffuse responsibility among these many visitors, thereby dampening the effect of psychological ownership on financial stewardship. One of our main motivations behind this work was to develop a portfolio of actionable interventions that increase psychological ownership. The studies that we presented here today focused mainly on investing in the self as a means to foster psychological ownership, but we have a variety of other studies that use different interventions. So for example, we show that the act of reserving a picnic area at a public park heightens users' psychological ownership simply by being able to have control over that space. We also document a novel intervention of using a 360-degree video of a public beach for users to develop intimate knowledge of this public good, which heightens their psychological ownership and thus their stewardship behaviors. So to wrap up, we document a variety of interventions that increase psychological ownership. We have shown you today how nicknaming a lake, planning a route, or just simply viewing a welcome to your park sign increases feelings of ownership. And one of the critical pieces of this work is that we're actually investigating real behavior. So we show that a heightened sense of ownership affects the likelihood that you will actually pick up trash and that you will actually make a monetary donation. So we document this effect both on effortful and financial stewardship behaviors. And we also show that the presence of this attendance sign can diffuse responsibility among many people and unintentionally decrease stewardship behavior. So it's really our hope that managers of public goods will leverage these interventions because they are truly inexpensive, low cost, yet effective ways to motivate and nudge people to care for our common resources. So with that, we want to say thank you for attending and thank you to the Journal of Marketing as well as AMA for hosting.
Thank you, Andrea and Joann. It's very interesting. I think that the paper is such an important contribution, and I appreciate you taking the time to present your results to us today. So let me ask you a few questions that I had when I was listening to you. One is, what if the sign were to actually say, welcome to our park? I mean, sort of evoking the same sense of like shared ownership instead of what you did, which was to say, welcome to your park. Do you think there would have been a difference?
Yeah, this question really taps into what the literature would call collective ownership. So here we're looking at individual level psychological ownership, something being mine. But the question of whether or not we would hold collective ownership is an interesting one of the things that we would need to consider is who is the our, right? What constitutes that group? So thinking about the identity of that group, is this your local community or is it the world more broadly? What's the size of that group? How similar are the group members? So there are a lot of factors that would be very interesting to look at that might actually affect whether or not the collective our does feel ownership. But that's an interesting direction for future work.
And I just want to add one thing to that. So in the management literature, it's interesting because John Pierce said that you have to feel individual psychological ownership before you feel collective. And that makes sense in a work context. It feels like it's my job, my organization. But our team really did talk about some of this collective ownership work. And we're not sure that would also be required in this context. So for example, if you're with a work group and they go out to a park and volunteer to clean up a path, you might first feel like it's ours before you feel that it's individually yours. So as Andrea said, we ended up focusing on this individual, but we feel like there's so many interesting questions around collective ownership.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a whole nother paper that
Yeah.
you could investigate, which is good. It's always good to see the next paper as you're finishing. Well, what about private goods? If you had if I owned a product, like my favorite car or something like that, do these things, are they relevant to private goods? Is that interesting at all to think about it that way?
Not only is it interesting, but we've looked at that. So let me give you one example that we have before we decided to focus on public goods is we used the way to increase ownership as control. So we had a hotel where people were checking in and they had 2 floor plans and they got to select their room. And then we had the cleaning staff judge how clean the room was when they left. So again, this idea of if you control it, you're going to take better care and you're going to leave the room cleaner. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that in that context. Another way to think about control is some of my work is on the sense of touch and physical control, just mere touch increases the sense of ownership, and ownership always increases valuation. So you value things more that you actually feel ownership for.
Yeah, and we actually do know, right, that you can feel a sense of psychological ownership for these private goods as well. And it's also very interesting that you can feel ownership even for digital or virtual goods. We're actually working on a paper looking at feelings of psychological ownership in virtual reality spaces related to touch. And so it is fascinating that this idea of psychological ownership can be very relevant to different types of products and in different domains.
That's super interesting. I think it's very valuable to the, kind of the non-profit, non-sustainability folks that could be listening. I could think about, car rentals, a lot of places where, the company does want some kind of caretaking of the product or service. Hotel rooms, like you mentioned, that really could be valuable. Or even in these on platforms where perhaps the sense of psychological ownership actually increases the likelihood that people are kind to one another, that they kind of put forth a positive and helpful stance in the platform where maybe otherwise they would engage in some kind of, destructive behavior. I don't know if that's something that you're thinking about.
I think that would be interesting. The other thing that you mentioned that it just reminded me, there was one study where talking about renting a car, where some rental companies allow you to choose a car and some assign a car. That simple choosing is again control. And people left their cars cleaner with that simple intervention. So it's really good example of another context. The social media context that you mentioned, we hadn't actually talked about that, but I think that would be incredible. So here's one issue. It's kind of the dark side of ownership. One dark side of ownership is too much ownership can be this territorial type behaviors. We don't think that's very relevant for public goods because you expect that other people will be using the goods simultaneously. For an individual private good, if you feel ownership and you sense that someone else also feels ownership, you may feel infringed upon and you may react in a territorial way. So I think that's what's sort of interesting about this construct is there's sort of the positive and the negative to balance. And maybe on social media, I don't know, we could get maybe some of both.
Absolutely. What about COVID? And obviously, top of mind for all of us is. I mean, does that change the importance of the research that you've done, the findings that you have?
Okay. Yeah. What I think in some ways, COVID has been devastating in a lot of ways for our project. In a way, we were lucky. So the ski study was conducted in February, right before everything shut down. And we feel like because more people are outside and there are fewer resources to take care of public goods, we feel like that it's more important than ever in this COVID time. In fact, there was this one Time magazine had a cover article about people not taking care of shared resources in COVID because people are overrunning the parks and there are all kinds of issues. So we think it's a really good time to get these simple interventions out that could make a difference for all of us.
Yeah, and with people frequently attending these parks, if parks are actually demonstrating visitor counts, right, that we know from this research that actually might diffuse the responsibility among these many people and might decrease the care that people would take for the natural resource.
The attendance sign is an interesting question, and because on the one hand it kind of signals popularity and therefore may, I guess, not as you're driving in, but if you were to see those kinds of signs on websites, for example, you might decide, well, there's some wisdom in this crowd, this large number of people who are choosing to go to this park. I mean, I guess some people would be dissuaded because the park might be crowded, but it could be a source of attraction as well. So there may be a little bit of attention in there that, have you thought about that? And then maybe more broadly reflect a little bit, if you will, on just the fact that, that attendance sign is suggesting something about kind of the value of doing what other people are doing, that the popularity may attract people. So I guess they're kind of related to one another.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So seeing a user count may have differential effects. And I think one of the things that we would need to consider is what's the implication behind this user count? So in a lot of contexts, like a user count on a drinking fountain, they're saying that this many users have engaged in eco-friendly behavior, and because of them, we've helped to eliminate waste, right? Waste of plastic water bottles. So the implication there is that this large number of people who have done this, they're doing something positive for the environment. And that's going to be fundamentally different than merely presenting a visitor count sign like we've done in our studies, where there's actually no implication that these people are engaging in environmentally friendly actions. They just simply have been there. So there are a lot of different aspects to this that we would want to consider. But in general, there is this notion that we would generally like to do what other people do, right? We like social consensus. And so it's an interesting question to ask.
Yeah, one thing to add to that too is if you think about, I thought about this when I was biking in on the bike path where they have the number. I think in our study, we found that the signs dampened responsibility and stewardship, but it still netted a positive relationship between ownership and stewardship. And if you're on these paths or you're going to the park, you get to intimately know the park, which could increase your feelings of ownership even more. And because of that, the net effect still seems like it would be positive, even if you dampen it slightly with these signs that you may be inadvertently dampening it, we still get the positive effect of ownership.
That's right. That's right. If we think about that graph that you showed, they were both higher than the, without any psychological ownership. It was just dropped down a little bit. So I think you're right. That makes a lot of sense to me. Well, maybe one final question that came in, which is, what about the applicability, the broader applicability of your results for nonprofits? So you're primarily focused on this tragedy of the commons, and I think that it is the strongest way in which this, or application of your ideas. But if you could just drop back, because there probably are a bunch of nonprofit marketers that are listening, and just do a little bit of reflection for us in terms of the applicability of your results to their organizations.
Well, we feel like this is very applicable to nonprofits, and in these times where resources may be scarce, stewardship of donations or even volunteering is really important. And you even see some of this if you think about like adopt a highway. So that's really like a naming, right? I adopt a highway and I feel more responsible. I take better care of it. But even things that some nonprofits do, for example, you could buy a brick, you put your name on there. And this feeling of ownership increases responsibility and further care for that resource. So I think inadvertently, some nonprofits are doing this already, and it's a really critical time to keep doing that.
I could definitely see that. And it's one of the things that is so powerful about not only the 3 studies that you showed us in detail, but that longer list that you showed us at the end, which are contained in the web appendix of your paper. They offer just a whole range of very simple to use applications of these ideas, things that, you know, teams could debate and say, well, we could do this naming approach, or there are just so many different ways. The video is, really compelling. There's a lot of neat ideas there. So I think there is a lot of value in what you've done, which is one of the reasons that we wanted you to present today. So, well, do you guys want to add anything as we come full circle?
I think just another thank you for letting us share this. And we all really do care about these resources, and we're hoping that people use these interventions.